Today, we're diving into one of the most famous books on the planet, the Bible. But here's the twist. We're not really looking at the stories in the book. Nope. We're going to uncover the story of the book itself, how it came to be, how it changed, and how it was handed down through thousands of years.
I mean, really think about it. It's a pretty simple question, right? But the answer is anything but simple. We have this idea of the Bible as this ancient, unchanging book, perfectly preserved. But what if I told you the version you can hold in your hand today is the end result of a long, sometimes messy, and very, very human process?
And here's the bombshell right at the start. Not a single original, handwritten manuscript of any book in the Bible exists today. Not one. From Genesis to Revelation, the autographs, the pages the original authors actually wrote on, are gone. They're lost to history. And that single startling fact kicks off an incredible journey of historical detective work.
So, if we don't have the originals, how in the world can we know what they said? Well, this is where scholars basically become detectives. They use a very specific kind of science to follow the clues left behind in thousands of ancient copies.
And this detective work has a name: textual criticism. Now that sounds a little negative, but it's not about criticizing the Bible's message. It's about putting the manuscripts themselves under a microscope. Scholars compare thousands of different copies, with all their little variations, to trace the words back in time, trying to figure out what the original most likely said.
Right, so you can probably guess that when you're hand-copying massive books for centuries, things are going to change. And those changes pretty much fall into two big categories. Some were just honest-to-goodness accidents, and others, well, others were made on purpose.
First, let's talk about the simple, unintentional mistakes. Just imagine you're a scribe. You're working for hours, maybe by candlelight. Your eyesight's not perfect. You could easily mistake one letter for another that looks similar. Or maybe someone is dictating to you, and you mishear a word. Or you look up, look back down, and your memory just flips a couple of words around. And one of the most common ones, a previous reader left a helpful little note in the margin, and you, the next scribe, accidentally copy it right into the main text, thinking it belongs there. These are just human errors.
But then, you've got the intentional changes. And look, this wasn't always some evil plot. Sometimes a scribe would be copying a gospel and correct a quote so that it perfectly matched how it appeared in another gospel. Or if a place name seemed wrong, they might just, fix it. And yeah, sometimes a passage would get a little tweak to make a theological point clearer. It just goes to show that for a long, long time, this text was treated as something of a living document, being shaped by the people who were trying to preserve it.
So that's the changes inside the books. But what about the books that didn't make the final cut at all? I'm talking about the Bible's deleted scenes. The time when these texts were being written was just buzzing with literary and religious energy, and a whole library of amazing books came out of it.
This brings us to a group of texts called the Apocrypha. Basically, these are books written in that period between the Old and New Testaments. They were actually included in the Septuagint, that's the big famous ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, but when the final official list or canon of the Hebrew Bible was settled, they were left out.
And then you get something called the pseudepigrapha. These are fascinating. They're texts where the authors wrote under the name of a famous biblical hero, like Enoch or Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch. This wasn't really about tricking people. In the ancient world, it was kind of a way to honor that great figure, to say, hey, this work is in their spirit, in their tradition.
And some of these books have absolutely incredible stories. You've got 1 Maccabees, which is this gripping historical account of a major Jewish revolt. There's Judith, an amazing story about a heroic woman who saves her entire nation. You even get extra stories added onto familiar books like Daniel, and then you get into some really wild stuff, like the Book of Enoch, which is this epic apocalyptic journey revealing cosmic secrets and tours of the heavens.
Now, for centuries, a lot of these texts were kind of lost or only known from much later copies. But then, in the 1940s, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. It was a complete game changer. Because in those caves, they found not only these lost books, but also copies of the biblical books we do know that were 1,000 years older than any we had before. It just blew the doors open on how diverse and fluid the whole biblical tradition was in its early days.
Okay, so let's take all of this critical historical thinking and apply it to the New Testament and to its central figure. This, my friends, might just be the ultimate scholarly challenge, the search for the historical person at the very heart of the story.
So the very first thing scholars do is make a really important distinction. On one hand, you have the Christ of faith. That's the figure of religious belief, of theology. But on the other hand, you have the historical Jesus. the actual person who lived and breathed in first-century Galilee, the man that historians try to understand using the same methods they'd use to study, say, Julius Caesar.
And here's what's so fascinating. When historians do this, they do not all end up with the same answer, not even close. After decades and decades of intense research, we have all these different portraits of Jesus. Some scholars see him as a kind of social revolutionary, others an apocalyptic prophet warning that the end of the world was near. Some see a witty, wandering sage, while others are convinced he saw himself as Israel's true, long-awaited Messiah. The quest is still very much alive, and the debate is fierce.
There's this great quote from the scholar N.T. Wright that I think just captures the whole spirit of this task. He says, "Schweitzer said that Jesus comes to us as one unknown. If I am right, the opposite is the case. We come to him as unknowns." What he's saying is, the challenge isn't just about figuring out who Jesus was. The quest actually forces us to look at our own biases and assumptions. We're the ones coming to this ancient figure as unknowns, trying our best to make sense of it all.
Okay, so we've talked about all this deep, academic detective work, digging through ancient manuscripts, debating history. So what? Why does any of this matter? How does this journey into the ancient world actually change how we understand things today?
Well, if we boil it all down, here's what we've got. First, the Bible isn't just one book, it's a whole library put together over a huge span of time. Next, we've seen that preserving these texts was a deeply human job, full of little accidents and intentional edits that have shaped what we read today. We've also seen that the books that were left out, these so-called deleted scenes, show us a much bigger, richer, and more complicated world than we might have imagined. And finally, the search for the historical Jesus reminds us that history hardly ever gives us simple, easy answers. In the end, learning all of this doesn't have to take away from faith or meaning. For a lot of people, it does the opposite. It makes it richer by showing the incredible, complex, and human journey these texts have been on. It's an invitation to read with more curiosity, maybe with more questions, and with a much deeper appreciation for the story behind the story. Which really just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. How does knowing all this change the way you read?